Okay, Euro, I'm back. This is the second part of the Industrial Revolution. So we've taken notes so far, starting with the definition of the Industrial Revolution. I always think of the definition first. It is revolution means change, right? Industrial means machines and factory use. And so I think of the change. What was the change? Life, the economy, and culture and social interactions, which used to be based on the seasons and the nature, skilled labor and muscle, animal and human, is then changed to time. The clock is now your master, and unskilled labor, helping machines, and the rise of machines from muscle is what's powering the Industrial Revolution. And we saw that there are two major, in Great Britain, there are two major events that happened, these evolutions or long-term changes. One is the agricultural revolution, which is really late 1600s through the 1700s. And at the same time, also, you have the advances in textiles right here. And so people used to use subsistence for these. They would make them themselves, the peasants, or there were guilds or groups of artisans who would make clothes for wealthier people. And then the textile industry, these changes, they're more efficient, less people to produce goods and clothes, there's more output, and we went through these changes that had to do with the enclosure movement and the agricultural revolution, and also this the evolution of different technologies to make textile work go faster, which went from the cottage to a mill to bigger things, factories, where these new machines used the labor of, in the beginning, it was the labors of orphans. And also, instead of for wool, they're using the raw material of cotton that's being taken from the British colonies in the Americas and in India, and then from the United States after it's independent, through slaves. And these effects that are happening in Britain, so the effects overseas, there's a rise in slavery, there's a rise in demand for cotton, a rise in the demand for factory workers too, and you have workers who are now working for wages. There's more food being produced, but there are also more people, there's population growth, and you have these theories like Thomas Malthus's theory, you have Adam Smith's laissez-faire theory that government should not be involved. And again, Adam Smith's theory is really, it is a reaction to mercantilism, the idea that kings controlled the economy. And he's saying, no, kings should not have that control. And he's basically, like Locke and the other Enlightenment philosophers, are arguing for the rights of wealthy white people, not arguing the vast majority of people are not being thought of. This is wealthy white people revolting against the king and nobles. And so here you've got effects of overcrowded, dirty cities and disease, wealthy factory owners. You have reactions against this rise of the machines with the Luddites, Captain Swing. There's a growing bourgeoisie of people who are becoming wealthy through these new systems, and an enormous working class that is quite poor. Then we went back to say, why does this happen in Britain of all places? And a lot of it's because it's an island. The water allows for easy transportation, the creation of canals that is protected from invasion. The also major raw material that's being used here is coal. There's a lot of it there, and also iron ore. And as we saw with the coal, think back to the video we watched earlier in the year. The problem with coal is when you dig to get it, the pits would fill up with water, and so they needed to come up with more efficient pump to get the water out of the coal mines. And so they developed, instead of an engine being used, a pump pushed by horses, they switched horsepower to machine power, and there are a series of engines that are created that run on coal, known as steam engines. And as the steam engine increases, I think I'm just going to write this below here. You have different, I'll just write inventions. So inventions, in addition to, right, the ones of the textile industry, other inventions you have, the big one's the steam engine. And this can be used, and James Watt and Matthew Boulton, the inventor and the Boulton, James Watt and Matthew Boulton, creating the steam engine. Watt's the inventor, Boulton is the entrepreneur, the person who gets the money to do it. And also it's easy to get money because in England has a Bank of England where people can get loans, or at least wealthy people or people with ideas can get loans. And that kind of easy capital or cash can allow for the development of entrepreneurs and ideas. Whereas in France, there was no Bank of France until Napoleon created a Bank of France. But that was after 1800. The Bank of England had been around since either the late 1600s or early 1700s. And so that gave them a kickstart too. And so the steam engine, this makes, this provides power. And so it powers factories. So a factory can either be, it used to have to be next to the water, like a mill. Now factories can be, they just need a supply of coal. So it powers factories. Also, it creates a locomotion or movement in trains. The first train was created by this guy, so George Stephenson. It's creating the rocket locomotive. And the city that really builds up during this time is Manchester, England. Like Manchester United soccer team, that's powerful. This city grows because of its coal and because of its manufacturing. It becomes, along with London, sort of the epicenter of the Industrial Revolution. And so you have the rocket. You also have different other inventions. You have the Bessemer process. And remember, this is Iron Man to Superman. You create iron into steel, is converted into steel. Iron goes to steel. And as a result of having steel, because steel is stronger than iron, this changes the skyline of the cities. And so you have the growth, because of this process, you have the growth of skyscrapers. And so during the second part of the Industrial Revolution, by the late 1800s, you have, so I'm going to say about 1890, in the later part of the 1800s, you have even larger changes that have to do with the growth of cities. And also you have subway systems by 1890 and 1900, and skyscrapers. And the sort of the modern city is born by 1890. Now, at the same time, you're having all of these problems as a result of industrialization and of overcrowding. And so there are these health crises, but there are also advances in public health. And so advances in public health, I'm just going to write this here, advances in public health, they also go along the course and the sort of timeline or continuum of the Industrial Revolution. In the 1780s, you have the cure for smallpox, which is the vaccine, and Edward Jenner. And we're experimenting on children. And that helps to decrease smallpox and applied to other deadly diseases. By the mid-1800s, you also have improvements in public health because of the work of Louis Pasteur, a Frenchman who was looking for ways to save beer from spoiling, but figured out a lot more than that and came up with the idea of germ theory using a microscope. And so you see, this is all of this science. This is built on the scientific revolutions like the 1600s, 15, 16, and 1700s. This is a new sort of swelling in scientific knowledge and happening during the Industrial Revolution and occurring around the same time. And so germ theory for Louis Pasteur leads to pasteurization, which reduces tuberculosis deaths. And so you have these achievements in public health, whether it's Jenner or Pasteur. You also have the big disease in the 1860s is cholera. in London because of overcrowding and because of water being, there's human waste in the water. But the solution for cholera is a sanitation system built by Joseph Bazalgette in the sewer system. And so as these problems are being created during the Industrial Revolution, you also have solutions to problems. So I think about these changes create these problems, and then these problems are also, people are creating solutions to these problems through public health, for instance. The other major public health issue, think about Florence Nightingale, and she is the founder of modern nursing. You see how all these people line up, Nightingale. And her big achievement, she started off, I'm going to say nursing and sanitation or cleanliness, was in the Crimean War when she found that most soldiers were dying not from battlefield wounds, but from disease caught when they were recovering from their wounds. And she changed the face of hospitals. And so you have all these advances in public health during the time. Now, during this time as well, you have different ideologies or belief systems that are coming into play. We've looked at the ones of capitalism, but then there are belief systems that challenge capitalism, because most capitalists are the ones who are benefiting from this system of no government regulation, the wealthy factory owners. However, there's a growing working class of people who are becoming increasingly upset, and people who are left out of the massive amount of wealth that's being created. And so some of these, the major idea that comes out of this, that for the working class is socialism. And the other one is utilitarianism. Utilitarianism is started by Jeremy Bentham. The main idea, and the way I remember it, is from the Spanish word útil, which means useful. If an idea is useful, if it serves the greatest good for the greatest number of people, so greatest good for greatest number, and that guy who came up with this idea was Bentham. Jeremy Bentham, the greatest good for the greatest number of people, then it should be a policy that the government uses. And so it encourages government action. Government action for what kind of things? Well, for example, for the sewer system. Where's the sewer system? Make an arrow over there. Sewer system. Or to regulate hospitals, or to create a vaccine program, or also to create roads. Okay, why would utilitarians want that? Because it's not about rich or poor, it helps all people. It's not like disease is only going to affect the poor, it affects wealthy and poor alike. Utilitarians believe that if you help a great number of people through government action, and it makes sense, then you will help all of society. The socialists believed that that from each according to their ability, and to each according to their need. So from each for their ability, and to each based on need. This is a system that there's several forms of it. It's basically, instead of giving more freedom and liberty, it gives more fairness. And so the idea of socialism is really to create fairness in society. And the socialists disagreed on how to do this. And so we saw different types of socialists. So I don't have that much space over here. I'm going to write I'll just do it right here. Okay. You had different types. There were utopian socialists who created model communities. And some of those utopian socialists, let's see. One example of a utopian socialist is, oh man, what's the name of him? The French guy. I'll come up with it. You had Robert Owen, who built his own model community. He was a factory owner and built a model factory. And so they tried to create these sort of perfect communities. You had other socialists who said to create fairness in society, well, you need to give people the vote. And so they were called the Chartists. So give voting rights. And they led their movement in 1848, and they had the government did not give them voting rights. So giving voting rights to all men, which was called universal suffrage. Of course, they're not talking about women, which would be truly universal, but the Chartists are talking about giving voting rights to men. The British government does not go along with them. They expand voting, but not to all working people yet. That's in the late 1800s and early 1900s. So these are other ways of socialism. You can get it through voting. You could get it through utopian socialism. And then the other socialists are through democracy. But there were also some violent socialists called communists. And their other term for them are Marxists, because the leader of this was Karl Marx and Frederick Engels. Karl Marx was from Prussia, later Germany, right? And he wrote the Communist Manifesto in 1848. And he called for a violent overthrow. And he thought it would be spontaneous. Remember that? Violent, spontaneous overthrow. And I'm going to write my hammer of the workers versus the bourgeoisie. And that was Karl Marx, or communists. And so there are people who wanted fairness either through utopian means, through giving the vote, through communists. You also had people who wanted fairness, if you remember back up here, the Luddites and Captain Swing, through destroying machinery. So there are all these different ways in which people argued. Oh, and I just remembered my utopian socialist, who is Fourier, who was arguing for model communities to be built called phalanxes, which had different personality types. And everyone thought it was crazy and no one moved into it, but he was still influential in his thoughts about utopian socialism. All right, so the Industrial Revolution, in a nutshell, is you've got this change from people working basically by muscle and skills and nature to this clock to unskilled to machine labor and all the effects that come out of it. Whether those effects are what we just saw, ideologies, whether the effects are on public health, whether the effects are on technology and transportation, whether the effect is on agriculture or different classes. The Industrial Revolution created massive change in society. And just think about it shortened time. I'm also going to write this up here. What did it do? Think of like the train. It basically shortens distance. People are able to travel. People are able to get goods from further away. And by the late Industrial Revolution, when you have skyscrapers, subways, you also develop things like refrigeration, where you're able to transport things like people's diets change, where you can eat meat or fish that have been refrigerated so they don't spoil and they can be transported on trains. And so people's lives in 1890 are much different than they were just 100 years ago in 1790, due to this massive shifting of industry. And the final thing that people usually ask about is the spread of the Industrial Revolution. Here's my island of Britain right there. It then spreads to Belgium and to France, and it gradually moves this way. It moves east. And here you have Germany And here's Austria, here's Italy, there's Spain. Typically, the southern part of Europe, it lags way behind. Also, Russia over here, it also lags way behind. Industrialization does not make it to Russia. We know by just pockets of industrialization, because by World War I, Russia does not have the industry it needs in order to take on the much more industrialized countries of France, or of Germany, of Britain. It can't compete with those, and so it falls behind. Similarly, the Ottoman Empire, they don't have the resources to industrialize, right? Russia does not have the waterways and canals. It doesn't have easily accessible coal like some of these other places. Northern Italy industrializes before southern Italy. And there's also, if you go over the ocean in the USA, there's also an industrial revolution, industrial rev, that takes place on the East Coast and gradually makes its way to the West. Okay.